This decaying building off the coast of Florida could have caused untold death. Back in the mid-1970s, when the Cold War was in full swing, the Soviet Union and Cuba, two communist leading lights, designed something that could have caused untold devastation. Located around 90 miles from Florida, this thing wasn't only terrifying, but also, for many in the United States, it was deliberately provocative. However, it was never finished, and perhaps that's just as well. The structure in question was the huge Uruguay nuclear power plant, which was an 880-megawatt dual-reactor facility that was given the go-ahead in 1976. It was to be built on southern Cuba's Caribbean shores, a location just half an hour's flying time from the United States and funded by the Soviet Union's financial clout. So when the US government caught wind of the plans, it was understandably alarmed. After all, the nuclear facility would be big enough to provide power for 15% of Cuba's population. And if something were to go wrong, then its proximity to Florida represented a potential national security risk to the United States. It wasn't until 1983, however, that construction of the Uruguay nuclear power plant began, with the laying of foundations and the building of a grand turbine hall. And while progress proved to be painfully slow, this had nothing to do with a lack of money. Indeed, the Soviet Union pumped in enough capital for a new settlement, Ciudad Nuclear, to be built beside the facility. This new area was supposed to accommodate the power plant's employees, who, as it turned out, would never be required to turn up for work. 3 years later, in 1986, Uruguay nuclear power plant was still years away from being finished. However, this was the year of the Chernobyl disaster. That infamous incident saw catastrophic levels of radioactive particles released over the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe following a huge blast at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. So if America wasn't nervous enough already, it certainly was now. After all, the Cold War was still in full swing, and the United States had spent much of the early 1980s pressurizing the Soviet Union economically, militarily, and diplomatically. It was, in short, desperate to nullify any threats. Uruguay's potential threat, though, was never realized. This was partly because Cuban construction workers tasked with building it lacked the required expertise. Instead, they had to rely on direction from Russian nuclear experts, and with the 1990s on the horizon, the clock was ticking. Indeed, the Soviet Union was running out of money. And this, combined with nationalist movements and subsequent revolutions across Eastern Europe, ultimately resulted in the Soviet Union's dissolution at the end of 1991. Moreover, the state's collapse should have spelled the end of Uruguay, and yet Moscow was reluctant to let it go. In 1992, for instance, the newly formed Russian Federation revealed its intention to continue the plant's construction, despite it having lingered on into a third decade. Russia suggested that it would be completed by 1996, a prediction that proved to be way off the mark. Writer and photographer Darman Richter, who visited Uruguay in April 2014, reckons that Russia had every intention of completing the Uruguay nuclear power plant despite the financial challenges and the shifting political sands. Speaking to Scribble, he says, whether as part of the Soviet Union or not, I'm sure Moscow would have wanted to keep hold of such a useful foothold on the American continent. Richter, who spent 3 hours roaming Uruguay's concrete shells, believes it wasn't just a lack of expertise that slowed down its construction, but some pretty challenging conditions. The humidity in the salty air is absolutely terrible for concrete, he explains. Coastal Cuba is just not a good place to build. For example, you need a cooling lake, the writer adds. I think the Cubans were trying to be too clever by trying to siphon off water from the Caribbean. It must have seemed like a neat idea at the time, but the result was that you're right on the coast with salt air and warm winds battering the place. It's little surprise, then, that the Uruguay nuclear power plant was never finished, despite being backed by a global superpower. Today, it stands abandoned and decaying, having succumbed to its challenging surroundings. It's protected only by some guards from a nearby town. For Richter, who has visited many communist-era sites, the opportunity to explore it was too good to miss. So he flew to Havana, hired a car, and, with a couple of willing co-conspirators, drove toward the city of Cienfuegos, a few miles northeast of Uruguay. On arrival, the group tried to get permission from a guard to enter, but he declined their request. So they got back in their car and made their way along an abandoned track, hopeful of finding an alternative way in, which they did. It was wide open, Richter says. It's not like there were any doors or windows to break through, the project hadn't got that far. It was like walking inside a skeleton, and it was just a case of doing it from a direction where no one was watching you. However, the explorer wasn't prepared for what he found inside this apparently dead structure. "We were looking out for holes in the ground and listening out for voices," he explains. "But the thing that really caught me by surprise was the animal life. There was a huge number of giant crabs. Another room was full of bats. The canals used for the cooling water are now stagnant, so it's also an absolute haven for mosquitoes." Richter had to be pretty careful as he was walking around, camera in hand. "The structure itself was dangerous and there were sudden drops and dark corridors," he explains. "Naturally you're on your guard, but knowing there are guards who don't want you there makes it a bit more nerve-wracking." Perhaps, in a parallel universe of infinite finances and resources, the Jurigua nuclear power plant would have been finished. In our own universe, though, it stands as a worn-out monument to an altogether more uncertain time. And an era that would have likely been even more tense had the plant ever been switched on.